They mocked the delivery man at every opportunity, and they laughed at him until the day he became their boss and presented them with their termination documents. For nearly a decade, Dorian Matthews had been conducting deliveries in downtown Phoenix. He was familiar with every alley, service entrance, and receptionist who scarcely glanced up when he dropped off a package. The work was not glamorous, but it was necessary for him to pay the expenses, and he took pride in performing it efficiently. He was perceived by the majority of individuals as merely another uniformed individual who had no significance and merged into the background. At Whitmore & Klein, a high-end marketing firm with marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows, this attitude was particularly robust. Dorian anticipated nothing more than a routine drop-off when he first entered those glass doors. However, he promptly observed that the employees appeared to regard him as inconsequential, or, even worse, something that should be disregarded. The receptionist scarcely glanced up as she signed for the package, as she had already shifted her attention to a more pressing matter. That was satisfactory. He was accustomed to that. However, as time passed, he began to observe more: the smirks, the murmurs, and the way some employees chuckled when he passed. Initially, he convinced himself that it was nothing more than his imagination, but this was soon proven to be false. As he placed a delivery on the counter one afternoon, a voice broke through the office din. "Man, can you imagine if the delivery guy was our boss?" Laughter ensued. Dorian refrained from turning around, but he could feel the heat rising in his chest. Ryan Caldwell, one of the senior account administrators, was identified by his voice. Consistently donning tailored suits, he cracks quips that are audible to others. Another voice, this time that of a woman, joined in. "Please, he's probably used to lifting boxes, not leading meetings." Additional amusement. Dorian maintained a neutral expression while presenting the tablet to the attendant for signature. She returned it without uttering a word. He had encountered more severe circumstances. He had dedicated years to developing the ability to disregard such matters. However, there was something about this moment that remained with him. It was not solely the words that were the issue, it was the confidence that accompanied them. The certainty that an individual of his caliber could never assume a position of authority. Passing by rows of glass-walled offices where employees sat at sleek desks, sipping overpriced coffee, and feigning to work, he walked toward the exit. Some individuals peered at him without showing any interest. He was scarcely observed by others. No more than another delivery man, another individual who is passing through. However, as he approached the door, he observed his reflection in the glass, his uniform, his delivery scanner attached to his belt, and his hands, which were still rough from years of lifting crates. They perceived him as nothing more than that uniform, and for the first time in a long time, that troubled him. The Arizona sun was so intense that it was nearly overwhelming. He entered his vehicle and remained seated for a brief period, his hands firmly grasping the steering wheel. He was not incensed. Anger was transient. This was something more profound, something more acute. They were under the impression that they were aware of his identity. They were unaware. However, they would shortly do so. Dwelling on matters was not a characteristic of Dorian. Over the years, he had encountered his fair share of disrespect, people speaking down to him, assuming he was illiterate, and behaving as if he were invisible. It was not novel. It was not even unexpected. However, there was something about that moment in Whitmore & Klein that remained with him. After successfully completing his final delivery that evening, he parked his van in front of his modest apartment in Mesa. The residence was modest in size, featuring a single bedroom, outdated carpet, and a kitchen with cabinetry that had seen better days. However, it was his. For an extended period, he remained seated in the darkness, his hands firmly grasping the steering wheel, and his gaze was fixed on the streetlight that illuminated the area outside his window. He had spent years convincing himself that it was irrelevant what others thought of him, as long as he worked diligently and earned a fair wage. However, this logic was not tenable tonight. The amusement at Whitmore & Klein was not merely a demonstration of ignorance. It was certain. Those individuals genuinely believed that they were superior to him, and that an individual of his caliber could never hold a position of authority. He required a conversation with an individual. Dorian retrieved his phone and contacted his older brother, Malcolm, the sole individual who had ever fully comprehended him. Malcolm recovered the item after 2 rings. "Yo, you good?" Dorian inquired. "I am in good health. What is the matter?" Dorian hesitated. "Had one of those days." Malcolm laughed. "Let me guess. Some rich folks made you feel like you weren't supposed to be in their space." Dorian rubbed his forehead as he exhaled. "Something like that. Yeah, well, ain't nothing new," Dorian acknowledged. "It is not, however. Today was distinct." Malcolm did not press him to provide an explanation. He never did. He simply remained in anticipation. They laughed. Dorian finally stated. "Like outright laughed at the idea of me being anything more than a delivery guy." Malcolm remained silent for a brief period. "And that got to you?" "It did. An additional delay." Malcolm then said something that Dorian did not anticipate. "Good." Dorian expressed dissatisfaction. "Good. Yeah, means you're finally tired of it." Dorian reclined, gazing at the console. "What am I supposed to do? Quit my job because a couple of idiots don't respect me?" "Nah, but you're smarter than that." "Smarter than them too." Dorian permitted those remarks to percolate. He had consistently demonstrated proficiency in mathematics, a skill that was rooted in strategy. At the age of 16, he had successfully converted a few $100s into a few thousand by flipping shoes. Subsequently, he pursued investments in stocks, small enterprises, and real estate transactions. He was more knowledgeable about the game than the majority, but he had never fully committed. The sound of Malcolm's voice interrupted his contemplation. "Remember what Dad used to say. When people only see you one way, you've got two choices: prove them right, or prove them wrong." Dorian inhaled. "Yeah, I remember. Then what you gonna do?" Dorian did not respond immediately. He was contemplating Whitmore and Klein, the extravagant suits, the arrogant smirks, and the way they had laughed at the notion of him being anything more than a delivery man. From their perspective, he appeared diminutive, and it is possible that he had been thinking in a limited manner up until this point. The worn steering wheel beneath his palms caught his attention. Then at the dashboard, a collection of delivery invoices was present. He was not entirely this. He was aware of this. However, they did not. Additionally, this necessitated modification. It was inevitable that they would be proven incorrect. However, it would not occur immediately. Really, Dorian was more than just a delivery man. That was the aspect of himself that he permitted others to observe. The portion that they presumed was the entirety of his existence. However, beneath the uniform, behind the worn-out work boots and routine drop-offs, he possessed an additional aspect, a subject that was not widely known. Dorian had been conducting his own calculations while they were occupied with the development of marketing campaigns and the analysis of client data. He had consistently possessed an entrepreneurial spirit. He had discovered methods of earning money as early as a child. He was switching sneakers, limited editions, hard-to-find releases, while other children spent their allowances on toys. He was aware of the precise time and location at which to purchase them, and more importantly, he was aware of individuals who were willing to pay double, and occasionally triple, the price for a pair. He had transitioned to the purchasing and selling of used vehicles by the age of 20, acquiring the ability to negotiate and identify a bargain before others did. He made an investment in equities, commenced investing in small enterprises. He never boasted about it. He never discussed it. However, he observed. He acquired knowledge. He constructed. Additionally, something even more significant had been in the works for the past year. Dorian had been contemplating a business proposal, one that had captivated the attention of serious investors, individuals who were not preoccupied with his background or occupation, but rather with his expertise. They recognized his potential. They observed his ability to analyze businesses, identify their vulnerabilities, and comprehend their value before anyone else. They were now prepared to provide him with support. He had been consulting with them in the evenings following lengthy shifts, spending late nights on Zoom calls, reviewing financial statements, and refining his strategy. He had already assisted in the quiet and efficient turnaround of two struggling enterprises. No one at Whitmore and Klein would ever suspect it. However, they were on the brink of discovering the truth. In a private lounge at a downtown hotel, he sat across from his chief investor, Anthony Wells, one evening. The establishment was sophisticated, featuring leather chairs, dim lighting, and the gentle murmur of business negotiations over costly whiskey. Wells was a businessman who had amassed his wealth through commercial real estate, and was known for his pointed, uncompromising approach. He did not devote time to individuals who were not sincere. Wells continued to drink his espresso. "So please elaborate. Why Whitmore and Klein?" Dorian lunged forward. "Because they're in trouble, and they don't even realize how bad it is." Wells raised an eyebrow. "Explain." Dorian removed a folder from his briefcase and placed it on the table between them, flicking it open. "They've been bleeding clients for the past year. Bad leadership, outdated strategies, spending money in the wrong places. They look successful on the surface, but their debt load is suffocating them." He began to examine the documents. "I give it 6 months before they either downsize or sell." Wells meticulously examined the figures, turning through the pages. "You're sure about this?" Dorian responded with a gesture. "I've been watching them for a while. Their biggest accounts are pulling back. Their client retention is dropping. They're relying on reputation, not results. And that's catching up with them." Wells grinned. "And you want to be the one to buy them out?" Dorian proceeded without hesitation. "I don't just want to buy them. I want to turn them around. Restructure, cut the dead weight, bring in fresh talent, make them profitable again." Wells reclined, his fingertips tapping against the table. "It's a bold move," Dorian corrected. "It is a wise decision." Wells laughed. He took another drink of his espresso, then set the cup down and reached into his jacket pocket. "You have confidence. I will grant you that." After extracting a check, he slid it across the table. Dorian gazed downward at it. The sum was precisely what he required to initiate his initial action. Wells stated, "You have my support. Don't make me regret it." The weight of the moment was felt by Dorian as he took up the check. This concluded the matter. The individuals who ridiculed him were unaware. They were amusing themselves by mocking their future employer, and they would shortly discover the truth the hard way. Dorian recognized the importance of perseverance. The acquisition of a company was not comparable to the purchase of a vehicle or the trading of stocks. It necessitated a strategic approach, precise timing, and the ability to identify ideal opportunities. Whitmore and Klein's finances had been the subject of his extensive research for months, during which he had identified their vulnerabilities and monitored their every misstep. The company was not only experiencing financial difficulties, but it was also in danger of collapsing. The sleek office, the refined brand, and the illusion of success persisted on the surface. However, pandemonium prevailed beneath the surface. Their leadership was unaware of how to address the situation, as their largest clients were decreasing in number, and their expenses were spiraling out of control. Dorian was not the sole individual who had observed. Rumors regarding prospective layoffs and restructuring began to circulate within the industry. Certain employees were capable of perceiving it. Some individuals were in denial, believing that their organization was impenetrable. However, Dorian was aware of the truth. He began making strategic, discreet moves with the support of Wells and the other investors. The initial step involved obtaining the shares. Whitmore and Klein was not a publicly traded company. However, it had a variety of stakeholders, including former executives, private investors, and individuals who had invested in the company years ago, and were now compelled to exit before the company collapsed. Dorian approached them individually, presenting them with offers that they were unable to refuse. Initially there were those who were skeptic, a delivery driver, investing in a prominent marketing firm. But Dorian possessed the leverage, and money spoke. They transferred their shares one by one. By the time the documentation was finalized, Dorian had the controlling interest, despite the fact that it took weeks of late-night meetings and meticulous negotiations. He was the proprietor of Klein and Whitmore. Making it official was the final step. Richard Langford, the current CEO, was an individual who had established his career through his connections and wealth. He was not particularly intelligent, rather he was fortunate, and fate had finally run out. Dorian arranged a rendezvous. There was no prior notification, absence of pretension, just a straightforward email to Langford's assistant. Subject: urgent discussion required. The sender's field contained Dorian's name, which caused the assistant, Ellen, to blink in perplexity. Ellen had been employed at Whitmore and Klein for more than 2 decades. She had observed him deliver shipments on numerous occasions. What was the reason for his direct correspondence to the CEO? She cautiously entered Langford's office after knocking on the door. "Sir, I just received an urgent email from Dorian Matthews." Langford did not raise his head. Ellen hesitated before responding. "Who?" The delivery man. Langford's fingertips remained stationary over his keyboard. He shook his head and let out a dry laugh. You mean the guy from the lobby? What could he possibly want? He's requesting an immediate meeting. Langford reclined in his chair and massaged his temple. He was already in a foul temper. Their largest client had recently terminated their contract, and profit reports were unfavorable. He had no time for frivolity. Langford murmured, waving a dismissive hand. Fine, bring him in. Let's get this joke over with. The energy in the building had already changed by the time Dorian entered the Whitmore and Klein office that morning. In the corridors, there were murmurs and glances exchanged. The receptionist, who had scarcely acknowledged him for years, abruptly sat up straighter upon his arrival. Langford was evidently agitated, as he waited in his office. When Dorian entered, he did not even rise. Langford, scarcely lifting his gaze from his computer, inquired, "What is the subject of this?" Dorian sat across from him and placed a thick envelope on the desk. "It's about the fact that as of this morning I own the majority of Whitmore and Klein." Langford did eventually gaze upon him. He raised his eyebrows, and then exhaled a brief, dismissive chuckle. "You? That's impossible." Dorian did not flinch. "Check the paperwork." Langford hesitated, before he retrieved the envelope and extracted the documents. His visage became paler as he flicked through them. He once more glanced upward, but this time his expression was markedly different. Panic. "This is a joke," he murmured. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Dorian maintained his composure as he reclined in the chair. "I think I'm your new boss." The documents were slammed down by Langford. "This firm isn't for sale." "It was," Dorian stated with ease. "You just didn't know it." Langford's jaw initially opened and then promptly closed. He re-examined the figures, as if to identify an error. However, there was none. The realization struck him like a ton of bricks. He was no longer the CEO. Dorian rose from his seat. "I'll give you until the end of the day to clear out your office." Langford was rendered speechless by his gaze. Dorian turned toward the door, but he paused before departing, while looking over his shoulder. "Oh, and Richard," he said with a slight smile. "Don't worry. I'm certain there is a delivery job available for you." Langford's mandible tightened, and his face turned red. However, he refrained from speaking. The office would never be the same again. And for the first time in years, Dorian Matthews was not merely passing through. He was the one in command. Dorian was aware that assuming control of Whitmore and Klein was one thing. However, ensuring that all parties comprehended the implications was another. The murmurs in the building intensified as he exited Langford's office. The faces of the employees were marked with confusion as they exchanged glances and whispered behind cupped palms. They had encountered him previously, hundreds of times, but never in this manner. Uniforms are not mandatory. He did not have a scanner attached to his harness. Confidence in his stride and possession of his presence are all that is required. The folder that he had brought into the CEO's office was recognized by a few individuals. A few individuals rose from their workstations in an attempt to comprehend the events that had transpired as Langford's door closed behind him. Dorian disregarded the glances. He had a more pressing matter to attend to. Ellen was Langford's long-standing assistant, to whom he turned. The expression on her face was inscrutable, as she was closely observing him. "I need the entire company in the main conference room," Dorian indicated. 10 minutes. Ellen hesitated. For years she had been employed by Langford. However, she had also observed the company's internal fractures firsthand. She briefly glanced at the office door that was closed before returning to Dorian. She stated, "I will send the email immediately." The employees of Whitmore and Klein entered the modern glass-walled conference room a few minutes later, whispering among themselves. Ryan Caldwell, the senior executive who had previously laughed at the notion of Dorian being in control, approached his colleague and scoffed. Ryan murmured, "What is this? A security briefing?" His acquaintance smirked. "Maybe they're laying off the cleaning crew." The jest was terminated when Dorian proceeded to the front of the room. No one took a seat. No one spoke. He gazed around, his gaze meeting theirs, and the silence grew longer. Some appeared perplexed, others appeared to be agitated, and a few, such as Ryan, continued to appear amused. It was ultimately Dorian who spoke. "I'm sure you're all wondering why I called this meeting." A small number of individuals exchanged views while they were on their feet. "As of this morning," Dorian asserted, I am the new majority owner of Whitmore and Klein. A moment of stunned stillness reverberated throughout the room. A small disbelieving chuckle was released by an individual, as if they were anticipating a punchline. It was never delivered. Ryan smirked as he folded his arms. You're joking. Dorian's expression remained unchanged as he directed his gaze toward him. Do I look like I'm joking? Ryan's grin was shaky. Dorian placed a substantial collection of documents on the conference table, including the financials, contracts, and every signed agreement that had facilitated this. He extended his hand toward the papers. If anyone has doubts, feel free to take a look. No one relocated. The room was enveloped by the weight of reality. It was not a joke. It was not an error. Dorian Matthews, the individual they had previously disregarded and ridiculed, was now their supervisor. Dorian permitted himself a brief moment of contemplation for the first time since entering the facility. He permitted them to contemplate the occasion, allowing them to reflect on it. He then spoke once more. I have been employed in this building for an extended period of time. The majority of you have never taken notice of me. However, a few of you did, and they ensured that I was aware of your opinions. His eyes momentarily shifted to Ryan. I remember every joke, every insult, every time someone assumed I didn't belong. Ryan shifted uncomfortably, but he did not speak. Dorian continued. However, I also recall something else. I remember watching this company make mistake after mistake. I remember seeing potential wasted because leadership refused to adapt. And I remember thinking that if I had the chance, I would do things differently. He advanced with a steady demeanor. That chance is now. The space was alive with a palpable sense of anxiety. Individuals who had been standing with their arms crossed gradually extended them. Others who had been leaning against the wall straightened. Dorian peered around the room before delivering his subsequent words with precision. Things are about to change. Some of you won't like it. Some of you won't be here for it. Silence. Dorian permitted them to contemplate this prior to proceeding. However, for those of you who are prepared to contribute, and who are eager to be a part of something greater, something stronger, you will be granted a position here. He allowed his eyes to wander the room for one final time. This organization is not the same as it was yesterday, and it is certainly not the same as it was when I arrived as a delivery man. Then, with a placid authority that left no room for doubt, he concluded, if you do not like that, there is the door. Another pause followed. The room was enveloped by the weight of his words, as if they were a final verdict. For the first time, the individuals in the office recognized that Dorian Matthews was not merely passing through, he was here to remain. Dorian observed the disbelief, unease and subtle glances exchanged between employees who had felt untouchable moments earlier in their faces. The conference room was thick with silence, and no one spoke. The reality of the situation had settled in like a slow-building storm. Eventually, an individual shattered the silence. Ryan Caldwell emitted a brief, bitter and hollow laugh. He crossed his arms and shook his head, murmuring, "This is insane, you cannot be serious." Dorian's gaze was fixed on him. "Do you believe that I would continue to speak in this manner, if I were not entirely sincere?" Ryan abruptly exhaled, running his hand through his hair. "So what? You enter this space, exert your influence, and we are expected to conform to your will." Dorian did not flinch. "No. Normally you are expected to fulfill your duties. If you are unable to manage that, you are at liberty to depart." Ryan scoffed. "Is it because you, of all individuals, have suddenly become the expert on managing a company like this?" Dorian approached Ryan with a steady voice, telling him, "I am more familiar with this organization than you may realize. I have observed your operations for years, observing the outdated strategies, the squandered potential, and the arrogance. Additionally, I have dedicated an additional number of years to the study of effective business management." Ryan tightened his mandible. "You are committing an error." Dorian responded with composure. "I was mistaken in believing that I was not welcome here." A few murmurs reverberated throughout the room. Some employees gazed at one another with apprehension, while others, particularly the junior staff who had been disregarded by higher management for years, appeared almost intrigued. Before proceeding, Dorian allowed the tension to subside. "Actually, let's discuss errors," he stated. He removed a folder from the stack on the table and opened it. "Ryan, given that you appear to have a lot to say, Perhaps you would like to elaborate on the reason your department is accountable for one of the most significant client losses in the company's history. Ryan's expression became tense. That is not, it is, Dorian stated with ease. And I have the reports to substantiate it. He tapped the folder. The client walked, and took millions in revenue with them. He had been over-promising, under-delivering, and failing to modify strategies when the market shifted. Ryan's complexion was an intense shade of red. Dorian shut down the document. So if we're questioning who deserves to be here, I'd say you have a lot more to answer for than I do. Silence. Ryan's mouth slightly opened, as if he intended to argue. However, he refrained from doing so, as he was aware that the numbers were accurate. Dorian exhaled deeply, and shifted his focus to the remaining individuals in the room. This is the point at which some of you begin to feel anxious, and you begin to question whether you are about to lose your jobs. He allowed the remarks to linger for a brief period, before proceeding. And the answer is, some of you will. That attracted their attention. Dorian pointed to the documents that were in front of him, stating, I have already conducted my research. I am aware of the individuals who contribute value to this organization. I am aware of the individual who has been gliding by. Additionally, I am aware of the individual who has been falsely claiming credit for the work of others. Some individuals appeared visibly tense, while others briefly glanced at their colleagues, as if they had abruptly come to terms with the repercussions of their office politics. I do not bear dead weight, and there is dead weight in this company, Dorian continued. You have nothing to worry about if you are present to perform your duties, to work, to contribute, to assist in the construction of a more robust entity. However, if your sole purpose is to maintain an appearance and collect a wage, you will not endure for long. Before administering the final blow, he allowed the matter to settle. I'll be sending out termination notices by the end of the day. The chamber appeared to have been devoid of oxygen. Ryan made a stride forward. You cannot simply, I can, Dorian replied uncomplicatedly, and I will. Ryan's mandible clenched, as his pride would not permit him to be the first to concede. He lifted his chin and adjusted his tie. That's fine. In the event that this is the outcome, I will resign. Dorian met his gaze. That is the first sound decision you have made in years. Ryan shook his head, and scoffed before storming out of the conference room, shutting the door behind him. A prolonged period of silence ensued. Dorian allowed the moment to settle before addressing the remaining personnel. For those of you who are still present, it is important to remember that Whitmore and Klein will not simply endure. It is being transformed into something that is superior to anything it has ever been. However, this is contingent upon the presence of the appropriate individuals. He moved his gaze across the room, observing the reactions of the individuals, some of whom were apprehensive, some of whom were determined, and some of whom were still processing the events that had occurred. If you're willing to step up, to work, to actually build something meaningful, you'll have a place here. Another intermission. But if you're only here because you think you deserve to be, because you're comfortable, because you think nothing will change, he directed his attention to the entrance. You can follow Ryan. The room remained silent, but this time, the silence was not a result of astonishment. Rather, it was a realization that things had changed. Dorian was no longer the individual they had disregarded, and from this point forward, he would never be. The energy in the office had undergone a complete transformation by the time Dorian exited the conference room. Some employees were in a state of awe, while others whispered in a low voice, stealing glimpses at the man they had failed to notice for years. Some appeared to be afraid, while others were intrigued. A small number of employees appeared to be inspired. Dorian refrained from allowing any of it to influence him. He had fulfilled his obligations. Now the actual labor commenced. He exhaled slowly as he entered the office that was previously Langford's. The space was larger than he had anticipated, with leather furniture, bookshelves replete with unread business books, and a substantial oak desk that likely cost more than his first vehicle. He approached the window that extended from floor to ceiling, gazing out at the city. This moment was intended to be distinct. He had dedicated months, if not years, to this endeavor, battling against every presumption, dismissal, and underestimation of his abilities. He had succeeded. He had disproven their assertions. However, as he stood here, gazing at the horizon, he came to a realization. This was not about avenging oneself. That had never been the subject. If it were, the satisfaction would have faded by now. He would have experienced the high of proving them wrong, of witnessing Ryan storm out, and the expressions on their faces when they realized the man they had mocked now possessed everything they stood for. However, that emotion was not the impetus behind his actions. He had done this because he was confident that he could construct a superior entity, not only for himself but also for the individuals in that office, who had been disregarded, dismissed, and underestimated, much like he had been. There were individuals in that building who possessed talent, ideas, and the potential to transform this company into something truly exceptional, with the assistance of the appropriate leadership. And there were individuals who no longer belonged there. He had spent years acquiring the knowledge that respect was not accorded. It was acquired, earned, and constructed through action, rather than words. His thoughts were interrupted by a gentle knock on the door. Ellen, Langford's erstwhile assistant, entered the building with trepidation. "Is everything in order?" she inquired. Dorian glanced up from the window, and nodded. "I am acclimating to the view." She smiled briefly. "I can only imagine that it appears quite different from this perspective." He briefly observed her. She was distinct from the others in that she had been with the organization for an extended period, witnessing its growth, errors, and gradual decline. "I have a question for you," he stated. She raised her eyebrow. "That's fine. What is the reason for your continued presence?" Ellen folded her arms in contemplation. "I am fond of the way this location was in the past. I am of the opinion that it could be achieved once more with the appropriate leadership." Dorian hesitantly nodded. Ellen hesitated. "To be frank, I did not anticipate this. I have observed numerous CEOs come and go, but I never anticipated that this organization would ultimately fall under your control." Dorian laughed. "Neither did they," she exhaled, shaking her head with a slight grin. "Langford has departed. Ryan resigned. Right now, there is a significant amount of uncertainty. There always is when change happens." She briefly observed him before nodding. "Well, for what it's worth, I believe this location could benefit from some modification." Dorian smirked. "Subsequently, let us commence our work." He returned his attention to the window as she exited. Change was imminent, not only for Whitmore and Klein, not only for the employees who were still grappling with the events of the previous day, but also for him. Because for the first time in his life, he was not merely endeavoring to validate himself. He was the one in charge. And this was only the beginning. The lesson was evident: do not underestimate an individual solely based on their starting point. Because one day, they may be the ones to sign your paycheck.